The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everybody to today's field brief advice 10-minute discussion or 10-minute presentation with a 20-minute discussion. Today is Wednesday, September 9th, 2020, and you are here for fire resistive rated assemblies. We truly do hope that everyone is staying safe. It almost seems like the 80%, 90% of California is having some difficulties right now. But again, we do hope that you're staying safe and your families are safe. You are here for fire resistive rated assemblies. You should know that in the go-to software, we've provided some handouts for you, both today's presentation, fire resistive rated assemblies, and tips from the experts, a guide for working on OSHPD projects. If you've participated and if you've joined us before, you'll know that we go over some housekeeping items. We announce the length of the presentation, which is going to be 10 minutes. And after the 10 minutes, you're going to have a chance to participate in about 20 minutes of question and answer, which you'll all be muted during the presentation. And at the end, you'll have an opportunity to virtually raise your hand using the GoToWebinar software next to your name. So click on that little hand and we'll call on you. When we call on you, be sure to unmute you because we're going to unmute you on our end. So that way you can participate in the discussion. If you have a specific project question, again, if it's specific to your project or you need some advice or some clarification, feel free to reach out to your OSHPD field staff, whether it's the regional compliance officer, district structural engineer, or fire life safety officer. They are a great resource. And if you have, again, a specific project question, contact them first. If you have a general question about this presentation, more a high level conversation that you're looking to have, please email us at oshpd.fddisu@oshpod.ca.gov. Again, that's oshpd.fddisu@oshpod.ca.gov. And if you experience transmission difficulties, be sure to log off and log back in using the same link that you received from the GoTo software. If we have transmission difficulties on our end, we will go ahead and do the same. We hope that doesn't happen, but it has, and technology can be difficult sometimes. But let's hope for the best, and we'll continue. So for today, we have Nancy Timmons. She is Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer for the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. And at the question and answer section, we'll also have the rest of the ISU team, or the Inspection Services Unit team, here as to assist us in answering any general questions that we may have. So with that being said, Nancy, I will go ahead and hand the mic over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Caesar. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this short presentation today. And I hope, as Caesar mentioned, we hope that you're safe and that your family and friends are safe too. So speaking of fire, we're going to talk about fire resistive rated assemblies today. And again, this is just a brief overview of what you know. It can be a multifaceted topic. So what we're hoping is we get this sort of this teaser out here, and then in the future do a lengthier webinar and dig into some of these components, and probably in multiple webinars, because when you start talking about fire resistive rated assemblies, it leads to all kinds of things, right? The doors, openings, protections of all sorts. But today we're just going to go through the brief basics here. So fire resistance rating and beforehand, so some of this is, it's code, so I'm going to be reading some of it to you, but I'll go back and talk about it so it's not just flat out reading code, because it's pretty boring. But this is a definition of fire resistance rating, and this is in chapter 2. So the fire resistance rating, the period of time a building element, component, or assembly maintains the ability to confine a fire, continues to perform a given structural function, or both, as determined by the test or methods based on test prescribed in section 703. And then you might recognize 703. 703.3 is a section that gives other alternatives when you don't have a listed approved assembly, like engineering judgments, prescriptive details, and 721, 722. So think about that as we go through this, because 7033 is specific to fire resistance rating, which are specific to building elements. So why do I talk about this is because you don't want to confuse the fire resistance rating with fire protection rating. So I'll get to that in a minute. So at the beginning of this, the period of time a building element. What is a building element? The building element is a fundamental component of a building construction listed in table 601. What are those? So in 601, your building elements, your primary structural frame, your bearing interior walls, your bearing exterior walls, non-bearing walls and partitions, both interior and exterior, and then floor construction and associated secondary members, and roof construction and associated secondary members. So we're talking about fire resistance rating. These are the elements we're talking about, as opposed to fire protection rating, which is defined as the period of time that an opening protective will maintain the ability to confine a fire as determined by test prescribed in 715. So two different things. So today we're talking about the fire resistance ratings. And then the opening protectives include fire door assemblies, fire shutter assemblies, fire window assemblies, or glass block assemblies in fire resistance rated walls or partitions. So opening protectives are just as it sounds, the protection of the openings within those fire resistance rated assemblies. So one of the reasons I want to talk about this today is it's kind of a starting point for a lot of what we do. So, as I mentioned, with these different webinars can branch off into openings, doors, all the requirements for doors, vertical joints, all kinds of things. But starting at the very, very basic, we often get plans that the wall legend looks like this, or something similar. This is just an example. So you have a existing 1 hour wall, a new 2 hour wall, an existing 2 hour wall. This doesn't really help the plan reviewer, or, these are construction documents, right? So it doesn't help the individuals out on the site constructing to the plan. Because what type of wall? You can have a 1 hour fire barrier, 1 hour smoke barrier, a 2 hour fire barrier. So the rating, yes, we need the rating identified, but also the wall type. What type of wall is it? You have firewalls, fire barriers, smoke barriers, partitions, fire partitions, smoke barriers. So I put this out there, and some may think, well, that's pretty basic, but we see it time and time again on the plans, and then it does cause issues. We had a project recently that when it was, the designer had the wall identified as 1 hour wall. It went through plan review, 1 hour wall, got out into the field, built as a 1 hour wall. But what type of 1 hour wall? So the FDD got out there, the field individuals got out there, looked at the room. So this room needs a 1 hour fire barrier. This wall is constructed as a 1 hour fire partition. What was the difference? How the openings were protected. So a lot of work had to happen at the end of the project that could have been avoided, through the beginning. So I'm bringing that up as one. Just identify the walls, how the code defines them, but also how the code names them. What are their names? You have firewalls. The firewalls are constructed a bit differently than fire barriers. So unlike a fire barrier or fire partition, the firewall must be constructed so it will remain in place if construction on either side of it collapses. So if if the structure on one side of the firewall collapses, that wall stands, and vice versa. So that's much different than how a fire barrier would have to be constructed. So you can see how that, that's a big difference construction-wise. These are different types. Obviously, firewall is a type of firewall, but also party walls are a type of firewall. There's always a general section in the code that talks about how the wall, well, whatever we're talking about, there's always a general section in the code. But right now we're talking about the general section for the walls. The firewall should be constructed in accordance with 7062 through 70611. And the firewall provides a complete separation. And then it talks about where the firewall also separates occupancies, which would be, if it's separating occupancies, that would be a fire barrier. So that in this case, the wall would be a firewall and a fire barrier. Then the most restrictive requirements of both types of walls would apply. And that's the case with any of them. If you've got a smoke barrier, fire partition, fire barrier, requirements for both types of walls apply when those walls often intersect. So firewalls, when are they required? So the code, you kind of have to play Where's Waldo with this part of the code. Where are these required? You find it by looking at different sections and knowing when they're applicable. So generally three times or three situations when they're separating two different types of construction, and also to allow for area and height increases above what the code minimum is in Chapter 5. And then when you have two adjacent walls of buildings that share a lot line. Then here are just some visuals for those. So in this example, you'll see that there are two different types of construction. You've got a group M 5B construction type adjacent to a group B 2B construction type. You got 5B and 2B, two different construction types. A firewall would be required. And you would look at table 706.4 to see what hour rating that firewall would be required to be. In this example, this is the example for the area and height increase. You can see that all occupancies are group M, what represents three buildings here, or three spaces. Group M occupancies, all 10,000 square feet. Chapter 5 indicates that the maximum size for an M without sprinklers, 24,000. So in this case, it's 30,000, so that exceeds what's permitted. So a firewall could be used to still keep the footprint that the client wants, but still stay code compliant. So the firewall could be used to allow the increase in size, because it's basically looked at as a separate building in that case. And as you can see in this example too, you'll see that the fire barrier is called out on the left. The 3 hour is called out on the right. That's just indicating or showing that fire areas. So don't get confused with that. Let me see if I could get my laser pointer here. So this is calling out for a 2 hour fire barrier. Here's where the firewall is. Putting this firewall in place brings the area back down to what is code compliant. This fire barrier is just there to indicate that that's needed for fire area separation. And then this example is for the occupancy, the party wall example, where you've got two different buildings, the lot line smack dab in the middle, right? And the firewall would be here to separate those two different buildings on these different lot lines. So the next type of wall is a fire barrier wall, fire resistance rated wall assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. As you read through the general, this is out of the definitions, but as you read through the general sections at the beginning of each wall type in Chapter 7, you'll see similar language, which is also why it gets confusing. As well, this says the same thing as the section for fire partition as far as what materials it has to be built out of. It's where the walls are required that will determine what type of wall you need, if that makes sense there. But anyway, make sure you're looking at the right type of wall that is the wall that you need. And the fire barriers you'll find in 707. And even though that section is talking about the wall, the fire barrier wall, horizontal assemblies can also be fire barriers. It's just not a fire barrier wall. It can also be fire barriers. In each of the sections, there's requirements for the continuity. 707.5 is the section for the fire barriers, basically extending from the top of the foundation, floor, ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, slab, or deck above. So that wall goes all the way through concealed spaces, through suspended ceilings. It goes all the way through what you want to say, slab to slab. Simple visual here for that. So types of fire barrier walls. It's just some examples of different times you'll see fire barriers. So shaft wall construction, the interior exit stairway and ramps, exit passageways, horizontal exits, atriums, incidental uses, control areas, separated occupancies, and fire areas. So as you can see here, there are many different types of fire barrier walls. And then fire smoke barrier walls. That's a fire resistance rated wall assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire, in which continuity is maintained in accordance with 707, and that is designed and constructed to resist the movement of smoke in accordance with 710. So a dual purpose wall, right? It's fire barrier and a smoke barrier. You'll find the requirements for fire barriers in 707 and for smoke partitions in 710. The fire partition is another type of wall. We usually see these as corridors, though the corridor walls, 1 hour corridor walls, though there are other areas and other type of occupancies that they're used in tenant spaces, malls, dwelling units, so enclosing elevator lobbies. You'll see them in those areas too. But what we usually see, where we usually say fire partition walls, are in the corridors. And again, a continuity. Each of the walls is going to have a section about continuity. Doesn't make sense to have a fire rated wall or smoke wall when there are gaps in between, wall to floor, wall to curtain wall in the joint. So there's requirements to keep these continuous and then to protect those connections where they occur at joints and curtain walls and such. This is the section 708.4 that, again, it's the continuity, but it's also the section that tells the 4 ways to build a corridor. I don't have the whole section here. As you can tell, exceptions 1 through 4 aren't listed. But if you're curious on the language of how to build the corridor, as opposed to just saying tunnel construction, which is common, look at this section. You'll read it, it'll confuse you. You'll need the pictures work better. We've got lots of those. So that's the section if you're curious. Another type of assembly, horizontal assemblies, those are the floor and roof assemblies. Horizontal assembly is a component for completing the compartmentation. Horizontal assemblies have all openings and penetrations protected, and of course, the protection's equal to that of the hourly rating of the floor or roof assembly. So you've got your cube, you've got the walls and the floor and ceiling that make up the compartment. Just an example, one simple example of a floor ceiling assembly. These pieces together, here and here, make the assembly. This by itself is not a rated assembly, and this by itself is not a rated assembly. The 2 portions together make the rated floor ceiling assembly. As a side note, watch when you see the insulation installed at the top, attached to this top layer of the ceiling membrane portion of the assembly. There's a section in 7 that indicates if the application will affect the way the temperature exchange happens, the heat exchange, that it has to be listed and tested that way. So what I mean by that, and I apologize, I forgot the exact section, but if the insulation is attached here, it has to, the assembly that you're using has to be tested and listed with the attachment here. Otherwise, it'll be attached up here. So if you got fire down here, this can affect how that heat exchange happens. Anyways, we don't want to get into the weeds with this. We can save that for the long presentation. Smoke barriers, of course, continuous membrane, and they're either vertical or horizontal and can be walls or floors or ceiling assemblies, and it's designed to construct to restrict the movement of smoke. Another visual, and of course with your smoke barriers and your rated walls, you got dampers, you got your floor ceiling assembly or floor assembly, and your roof ceiling assembly or floor ceiling assembly, continuous all the way through, dampers where needed. Smoke compartment is a space within a building enclosed by smoke barriers on all sides, including the top and bottom. And of course, for our occupancies, that smoke barrier is also going to be a fire barrier. But remember, it's a cube. It's not just the walls, but also the ceiling and floor ceiling assembly above and below. Which I bring that up because L ratings. Sometimes it's forgotten that the floor ceiling assemblies and roof ceiling assemblies would also need an L rating. The joint assemblies an L rating because it also makes up part of this smoke compartment, smoke barrier. This is just a visual. Smoke barriers are required to be continuous from outside wall to outside wall, like this one in the middle, to separate two different smoke compartments. And then there are exceptions in 70942 or language in 70942 that says except they don't have to go outside wall to outside wall if they are used for other reasons, like when you need a smoke barrier at the elevator lobby, then this smoke barrier can terminate at another 1 hour rated fire barrier or another smoke barrier. Same here, when the area of refuge is required to have the smoke barrier, this doesn't have to go outside wall to outside wall. In this case, it can terminate again at another 1 hour fire barrier, another smoke barrier. This one on the right is an example of what is wrong. This is trying to show, okay, this is a little smoke compartment and this is a smoke compartment. This would not comply with code because the smoke barrier walls used to separate this smoke compartment do not carry through outside wall to outside wall. So this would not be okay. These, on the other hand, would be because they're smoke barriers that are not used for smoke compartments. They're used for the lobby and the area of refuge. Smoke partition is another type. We don't see these too much by themselves in I-2s in California. I-2s in other parts of the country, you will see smoke partitions all over the place, including their corridors, but again, not in California. We have 1 hour fire partitions, but smoke partitions that's a wall assembly that extends from the top of the foundation or floor below to the underside of the floor roof sheathing deck or slab above, or to the underside of the ceiling above where the ceiling membrane is constructed to limit the transfer of smoke. As you can see in this picture here, we've got the smoke containment in front of the elevator, which is there to replace a lobby. So you've got your floor-to-floor smoke compartment that we talked about. Even though this elevator shaft is rated, fire rated, it doesn't have the smoke containment. So this is required to contain the smoke from potential floor-to-floor spread. And that smoke containment is an example of a smoke partition, obviously not a constructed one like JIP, but it is an example of one. Smoke partitions are kind of vague with, the general section will say smoke partitions installed as required elsewhere in the code shall comply with this section. So elsewhere, again, another where's Waldo, where is this information saying we need them? Again, in I-2s in other parts of the country, they can use smoke partitions, not in California. Elevator lobbies and sprinkler buildings could have smoke partitions. And then another one, number 3, incidental uses. I don't want to focus on that either because that's also not in California. But you do see them, you just don't see them often. So what are not all the other issues, but what are many other issues or topics that come into play when we're talking about fire resistant rated assemblies, which is why this 10-minute is brief, but we can go hours into this, is that leads to vertical openings, penetrations, and fire stopping, fire resistant joint systems, the opening protectives, and you could have 2 days worth of all day worth of presentations for doors, windows, glazing, rating, the size allowances, when do you need temporize, what opening can be in what type of wall, how big can it be, and then how do the doors work? Those are a bunch of other presentations all in one. And then of course, ducts and dampers, where they required, where there are exceptions, where you don't need the dampers. Concealed spaces, a section that is sometimes forgotten about when it's not a 5A. An FT and L ratings are brought, it could come into play, continuity, of course, and then the supporting structure. Some, whatever the wall is rated or the assembly is rated, anything supporting it has to have that same rating. That comes into play, and then many more. So again, just a brief overview of fire resistance rated assemblies, and that is the end of that. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Nancy, for that great presentation. That was a lot of information. So we hope that everyone who joined us was taking notes. And if you didn't take notes and you want a copy of the presentation itself, feel free to download it from the GoToWebinar software. As again, we provided you the presentation that we shared with you today, and we've also provided you a tips from the experts document, a guide to working on OSHPD projects. We do have a little bit under 5 minutes to answer any questions or comments. And as I look through the GoTo panel, I don't see anyone with their hand raised, and I don't see that anyone typed in a question into the GoTo panel. So Nancy, this question is for you. If someone was to have a specific question about this presentation, is it okay with you if they email you with a question? And maybe we can provide your email address as well?
No way. Of course, definitely. Definitely call anytime or email, message, whatever, whatever you want. Always open to talk about this and answer any questions that come up.
Great. And for those that, if you have something to write with, the email is NANCI or Nancy .Timmins TIMMINS at oshpd.ca.gov. And if you have a general question that maybe we can as OSHPD Inspection Services Unit can answer, feel free to email us at oshpd.fddisu@oshpod.ca.gov. We do have 2 questions that just came in. And maybe Nancy, if this is something that you can help with. And again, we have about 4 minutes left to answer these questions. So we'll do it as briefly as we can. The question reads, the language at 703.7 appears suggestive in terms of identifying wall types. Should a fire barrier be labeled as a fire barrier or a smoke barrier as a smoke barrier?
So yeah, label it what it is. If it's both, label it as both fire barrier, smoke barrier, so the reviewer can see, can verify that any opening protections are in place for the most restrictive and both types are covered. So if it's a fire smoke barrier, usually we'll just see both labels put in there. FB and SB kind of overlapped with each other. So just identify it for what it is. Because if it's just fire barrier alone, then we may not see that it's part of the smoke barrier and part of what's making up the smoke compartment. A smoke barrier alone is not something we generally see. It would also obviously be a fire barrier, but make sure if it's serving both, like you've got a fire barrier that's in place for an incidental use separation, but it also happens to run along the same wall as the smoke barrier wall for the smoke compartment. And we're looking at that for 2 separate reasons, and would need to know that both types of walls are there and continuous.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question. I think this will be the last question before we close this presentation out. The question is, do you have anything off the top of your head as a most common miss you see in the field?
It's the way the walls are protected. So, and that again comes in from step 1 with how is it designed and what was on the plan during plan review. And therefore, how did that get constructed? And if we have, like I mentioned in the very beginning, the wall types that aren't labeled appropriately, then there may be the opening protectives or damper protection, for example, that isn't there, that needs to be there, but was missed because the walls were labeled. So that is something we actually run into frequently. I was on a site a couple weeks ago that the fire life safety sheets showed ratings and wall types in one manner, but it wasn't coordinated with the architectural sheets. So the building was built off of the architectural sheets, of course, and they weren't coordinated. Different wall types were, there were a lot of problems. I would say that, because those sheets weren't coordinated, but they are the construction documents, and so we had different protections that weren't in place, the wrong types of doors, different sizes of openings that shouldn't be there for certain wall types. So I think that would be one of our bigger ones, is the way the openings are protected in the wall are often not accurate because of an unfamiliarity with the actual wall type, which is why bring up this presentation. Is there's all these different types of walls. What are they? They're not called occupancy separation or area separation anymore. So they have these, they're not new names anymore. They've been around for 13 years or so. But I would say, sorry, long answer. I guess it should be a short answer there, but it's usually the way the openings are protected or not protected because the wall types weren't called out accurately.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. That's awesome. That's good to know. We are out of time. We do want to send our gratitude and tell everyone thank you for joining us today on this presentation. We hope that you've enjoyed and learned something. If you already were familiar with the subject, at least hoping that it kicked up some curiosity. And want you to know that we do appreciate your feedback. So feel free to email us at oshpd.fddisu@oshpod.ca.gov. Maybe you can provide some more suggestions on future webinars like this that you'd like to see. Also, with that being said, want to go ahead and point out that on the 16th of this month, we're going to have guest speaker Richard Tannehill, Building Standards Unit Supervisor, discussing accessibility. We will have another presentation on electrical coordination and a questions to Paul Coleman. Paul Coleman, for those that don't know, is our Deputy Director here at OSHPD. So please join us. Please feel free to spread the word. And if you have any questions about a specific project, a specific issue at these projects, feel free to reach out to your OSHPD field staff, whether it's your regional compliance officer, district structural engineer, or fire life safety officer. They are a great resource and always willing to have that conversation with you and provide some clarification and answer some questions. Again, we want to go ahead and thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay safe and make sure you stay healthy.
Thank you, everyone.